I've had plans to talk about Onimusha for a while now. Originally, I had hoped to finish my Resident Evil video project series, or at the very least get the original 3 Resident Evil titles done, so that way I could have talked about the Onimusha trilogy in my Past Track series. However, given that Capcom had officially announced an Onimusha Warlords HD, not Genma, I needed to change those plans. So now instead, not only will I review the newly released HD remaster, but also the original PS2 release alongside the original Xbox port, simply known as Genma Onimusha. Of course, this is going to be one lengthy video if I cover all 3 versions, so I'll be putting up some rough timestamps on screen as well as in the comment section to let anybody skip ahead and watch the review in bursts or skip to sections that they're more interested in hearing about. That being said, I will be covering the story first as per usual with my reviews, and then I'll be covering each version as follows: PS2, Xbox Original, and the HD Remaster via the PS4 version. So without any further delays, let's get right into the review. I think it's important that if I talk about this HD Remaster, I bring up the most obvious change, which is somewhat controversial: the game's soundtrack. As some of you may or may not be aware of, the HD Remaster has a newly created soundtrack for the game. This is because a few years ago the composer Mamoru Samuragochi was doubted to be legitimately deaf, and later admitted to the fact that he actually was not deaf. The following year, his ghostwriter Takashi Nagaki stepped forward to shed some light on Samuragochi. So if you're wondering as to how Samuragochi went from making, and I say making very loosely, making the Resident Evil Director's Cut DualShock version of the soundtrack to Onimusha's soundtrack, well, now you have some context as to why and how that happened. It's a shame too, because the original soundtrack is fantastic. Now that's not to downplay the new soundtrack, but I do think that it's worth mentioning. So if you hadn't kept up with that bit of news, at least now you have that context before we get into talking about the game itself. And just for example's sake, I want to give you guys an idea as to what the original soundtrack sounded like versus what the remaster soundtrack sounds like. Soundtrack aside, let's get back on track and talk about the story for Onimusha. Onimusha takes place during the Sengoku era of Japan. For anyone that's not familiar with Japanese history, this is a point in Japan where the country was in a state of civil war, where warlords fought over to take control of various states to gain more territory in the hopes of becoming the ruler of Japan. The intro gives us a glimpse into the Battle of Okehazama. This is where we get introduced to our sort of main antagonist, Nobunaga Oda, whom, after being informed that the enemy commander's head has been taken, gets shot by a stray arrow. From afar, we also get introduced to our main protagonist, Hidemitsu Samanosuke Akechi. While he isn't directly involved in the battle, he does happen to be attacked while it's occurring. After receiving an urgent letter from his cousin Princess Yuki, stating that the servants and maids within Inabayama Castle have been disappearing, fearing that it might potentially be the work of monsters, Samanosuke sets out on a quest to rescue her with the help of his companion, Kaede. Samanosuke does end up finding Princess Yuki, but their time together is short-lived as they're attacked by a large demon. Samanosuke, being unconscious, is then reached out to by the spirits of the Oni clan, who had been subverted by the demons known as Genma, and is then granted the power to absorb Genma souls with the Oni gauntlet. He then ends up finding orbs which contain weapons with various elemental powers. With his newfound powers, Samanosuke is determined to rescue Princess Yuki and destroy any demons that get in his path. That's pretty much the story summary without spoiling it. The reason why I don't particularly want to spoil it is just for those newcomers that are coming in that had never played the PS2 original or the Xbox version of the game. So for anyone that is new that wants to avoid me talking about spoilers that are particular to the story aspect of the game, then you should skip ahead to this particular timestamp. Otherwise, everyone else who just does not care about spoilers, you can kind of just hang around and wait until this kind of goes away, so that way you can focus on what I'm about to talk about that is spoiler specific. Everyone else who's skipping ahead, you'll be skipped to a point where I talk about gameplay, but I digress. I'll give you all a few seconds just to consider whether or not you want to skip this particular portion of the video. Are they gone? Good. Let me address the bit where I said Nobunaga Oda is our sort of main antagonist. See, in the game, you do see a resurrected Nobunaga in the initial cutscene, and Samanosuke ends up finding out early on that he's been resurrected, and has made allegiance to the Genma as an eternal slave of theirs.
I haven't seen one as foolish as you since that, Nobunaga.
Nobunaga?
I operated on and resurrected that pitiful Nobunaga after he was killed in Okihazuma. He then made a pact with the demons and pledged his eternal loyalty to serve us forever as our slave.
No!
Oh, yes, it is indeed true.
The thing is, though, you never actually run into Nobunaga at all in-game. In fact, he's only in pre-rendered cutscenes, and I'm not exactly sure if this was the intention from the beginning of development or not, so that's kind of confusing to think about, especially considering the fact that Onimusha was originally going to be a PlayStation 1 game, and as a spin-off to Resident Evil known as Sengoku Biohazard. However, because it was a late PS1 game at the time, Keiji Inafune did think that it would be best to port it over to PS2, so I'm not exactly sure if that had any sort of influence as to Nobunaga's involvement in the full game and the story itself. I'm not sure if they just cut down on the character's role, or if this was just something that they had intended from the very beginning. So that jump from PS1 to PS2 not only made the game shorter than intended, but it probably cut a lot of good sections from the game that were on the PS1 version no longer seen on the PS2 version. If you look back at an early trailer for the game, there's even areas in the game that the Genma port doesn't have at all. So it wouldn't be surprising, to me at least, if Nobunaga initially had a much bigger role, and then with the PS2 port, that was just all cut out. So it's disappointing, but him being absent from the game doesn't make him irrelevant in the story or the plot, because as you'll discover, he becomes a bigger part of the games when you get to Onimusha 2 and Onimusha 3. Okay, now that we have that small bit of spoiler talk out of the way, let's talk about the PS2 port from a gameplay perspective. Onimusha Warlords on PS2 controls very similarly to other Capcom titles that have used the fixed camera angled perspective and tank controls such as Resident Evil and Dino Crisis. However, unlike those games where you primarily use guns to attack, Onimusha has you using swords with various magic attacks. Each sword has its own element and performs differently from one another. And if you're willing enough to go through the Dark Realm, there's also a secret obtainable sword that you can unlock as well. While the primary means of attack are the swords you acquire, you do find two projectile-based weapons as Samanosuke, those being a bow and matchlock gun, which have two types of ammunition each. Kaede, on the other hand, uses a dagger, and in place of her magic attacks, has kunai as projectiles. Aside from your basic equipment and abilities, you also have the ability to block, lock on, and strafe, or move freely, quick turn, and in Kaede's case, jump over enemies to get an advantage during a fight. Now there's 4 types of upgrades that are exclusive to Samanosuke in this game: weapons, orbs, consumables, and the gauntlet, which is your primary means of upgrading. Granted, you do get better armor and items that increase your magic and health, but those upgrades don't require you to use souls. Also, in the case of the gauntlet, you don't upgrade it manually, it just upgrades automatically after a certain amount of souls have been absorbed, and when you go into the save mirror and choose the enhance option, you'll just see a little message pop up saying that the gauntlet has been enhanced. What this upgrade does essentially is allow you to absorb souls at a much faster rate, so you have to absorb more souls if you want to be able to absorb these souls faster in the middle of combat. Your weapons and orbs have a level cap of 3, and while I personally was never a fan of this in Onimusha, Warlords is somewhat justifiable in this case, just given the fact that the game is so short. Consumable upgrades consist of bullets, arrows, and herbs, requiring a specific amount of souls per upgrade. Health and magic upgrades can be done using magic and power jewels, some of which you could just find lying around throughout the castle, while others are locked behind puzzle boxes that you need to decode using a set of books that you also had to find throughout the castle. It should also be noted that it is possible to not only beat the game without any health or magic upgrades, but you can miss out on some of the pickups like the magic and power jewels, because some of them are tied behind Kaede, and in the sections where you do play as Kaede, in some cases, or actually in a lot of cases, you're not able to go through those areas that Kaede went through because they are specific to her, not Samanosuke, so that is something to keep in mind if you do plan on playing this game. Lastly, there's your armor upgrades, and unlike the weapons, they all look the same, just slightly recolored, with one in particular having the ability to prevent souls being stolen from a specific Genma type. While they do give you higher defense, it really would have been nice to have a all-new look to the armors. That is something that's addressed in Genma, but we'll get to that at a later point in the video. Enemy encounters are generally in tight confined spaces, so you'll have to think about how you'll take enemies out in certain situations. Sometimes it's better to take out the biggest demon in the room first, but other times it might be better to focus on smaller demons. The same could be said about enemies that are just faster than others, and vice versa. If you really know what you're doing, you can do something known as an Isen attack or a deflect critical. Isen attacks are strictly based on your timing. If you hit the attack button just at the right time as an enemy is about to land their attack, the screen will flash white and the enemy will instantly die. Deflect criticals, on the other hand, have the same result, however they are performed only if you block at the exact frame on an incoming attack. This means that if you can block at the very correct moment, at a very specific moment, a ring of light will pop up, signaling that you should attack. This means that the attack that you just blocked has been deflected, meaning that you can go ahead and perform an Isen in this case. This is a very vital part of the gameplay because if you go ahead and perform either one of these types of attacks, you will be rewarded by getting more souls compared to how you would if you had normally killed them. Secondly, you're always guaranteed yellow souls, so if you're going for a no heal run, this would be your only way of healing without using healing items. I'll talk a little bit more about soul types in a moment, only because the main new mechanic in Genma is tied to souls. That being said, this is really everything you need to know about Onimusha on PS2, so I think now is pretty much a good time for us to transition actually over to the Xbox version of Onimusha, otherwise known as Genma, and discuss some of the changes made to gameplay as well as some of the new content that was introduced. Genma Onimusha is actually rather interesting to talk about, given that it not only tried some very unique things from a gameplay perspective, but also messes with your knowledge on the original version of Warlords. For starters, items have been moved around to various locations throughout the map. You might remember a key item or a health item being in a particular box in the original game, only to find that in Genma it's no longer there. This doesn't just apply to items though. Enemies in certain instances are placed in locations that they were never at originally. And this is probably why for this particular version of Onimusha they start you off with a talisman as opposed to having you find one midway through the game like in the original PS2 port. For better or for worse, the game has been rebalanced to be much harder, so enemies will deal a hell of a lot more damage this time around. Oh, and since I mentioned that I'd be talking about souls earlier, let's get into that right now. Genma Onimusha introduced the green souls into the game. In the original, there were only red souls which were used to upgrade your gear, blue souls which were meant to replenish your magic gauge, and yellow souls which were meant to replenish your health. Now I'm not exactly sure if the green souls were more or less a prototype to the purple souls that were found in later games such as Onimusha 2 and 3, but given how close the launch of Genma Onimusha was to Onimusha 2 Samurai's Destiny, I just can't help but assume that this actually is the case. The idea of the green souls is that you have a limit as to how many you can absorb at once. If you absorb that amount, you can either save them for a more dire situation or use them and be able to heal whilst also being invincible to enemy attacks for a short period of time. However, that's not all to the green soul mechanic. You see, enemies can also absorb these souls as well, and if they do, they enlarge themselves and turn into a blood red color. You can try to absorb the souls before they do, but keep in mind that when you do that, you will be in a tug of war state for that particular soul. This new mechanic makes things really interesting because if you're in a crowded room, you have to be extremely cautious when absorbing souls. You end up leaving yourself vulnerable, so it's best to pick and choose when the best time is. If an enemy does successfully absorb a green soul, there is a chance that you can actually knock them out of the blood red state, or you can actually draw out more green souls from them, which gives you the chance of possibly becoming temporarily invincible using the green souls. Thankfully, the only enemies that you have to worry about are the standard enemies. Standard enemies are the only ones that can actually absorb green souls. Bosses are unable to do this, so you don't have to worry about bosses becoming twice as powerful because of this new mechanic. And since we're on the subject of new mechanics, I should talk about the charge attacks. This is another reason why I had mentioned Onimusha 2 earlier. That game also had a similar weapon charge mechanic, so in a way I assume that Genma was used to test out those mechanics. But I digress. The idea is that you hold on to the attack button, and depending on the color of the charge, the more powerful the attack becomes. If you go up to the 3rd level charge, you'll be able to sometimes draw out souls from living enemies, giving you more experience to upgrade your gear. Upgrades have been slightly redone in Genma. Upgrades to the orbs and weapons are done simultaneously as opposed to individually. Of course, this means that upgrades for weapons take a little bit longer than before, but honestly I don't mind this change given that it makes things a little bit less confusing for newcomers as to which they should prioritize first. The only downside to this change that's major, at least in my opinion, is that now all magic attack power is tied to charging the magic attack itself. Also, another small downside is the way that Ryzen has been slightly reworked from its PS2 iteration. To give an example of this, doing a magic attack when there was no enemy present would not drain the magic gauge. However, in the Genma port, for some reason it does. I'm not exactly sure why this was done, it just is a thing, and I can't really explain as to why they thought they needed to change it, because later iterations and sequels of this game will not actually feature anything like this for weapons that are similar to it. However, the changes don't stop there. There's a new enemy type, 2 new bosses, new areas, new armors, and an all new dark realm that's much harder than the 2 that were originally in the game. The new enemy type is a set of armor that is actually on fire, and technically speaking, this enemy will later on get reintroduced into Onimusha 3. But in this game's case, it actually has something to do with the new boss type from the Dark Realm. There's also a doll, and the best way that I can describe this doll, simply put, is that she is the nemesis of this game. What I mean is, if you don't kill her, she'll follow you through several rooms. There is a catch to killing her though. If you want to take down this enemy, you're going to need to use your magic attacks and also your charging attacks to increase your chances of putting her down. And trust me when I say you want to either take her down as soon as possible or run away from her as soon as possible for the better. The doll is just no joke, it will absolutely destroy you, and I can't tell you how many times I've had to see the "you died" screen whenever I was facing her. The new areas, while not really adding much to the game overall, is nice to see given the fact that they are unique locations that were not found on the PS2 version, like this one that leads to the waterfall, or this once blocked off area that can now be accessed in Genma that leads you to the new Dark Realm. Little additions like that are always nice to have. Lastly, I should talk about the armors and the new Dark Realm at once because there is a nice little bonus unlock in the new Dark Realm. In Genma, unlike the original, the armors you find have a unique look to them as opposed to being just color variants of the armor that you already have with higher defense. And in my opinion, this is really nice because it actually makes you feel like you've gotten somewhat of an upgrade to your armor rather than just a color change. To top it off, there is a fourth armor that you get in the game in a very unique way. So remember how I brought up the new boss that's also tied to the new enemy types introduced to this game as well as the Dark Realm? Well, this new boss is literally your last armor upgrade, simply known as the Ogre armor. It's not only on par with the Merciless boss fight in terms of difficulty, but it also is the best armor to have since it gives you the most defense. I don't know how you guys feel about this, but I really love the idea where you literally have to fight your final upgrade in order to earn it. And going through this harder Dark Realm that costs you souls to unlock each stage makes it all the more worthwhile. Of course, if there wasn't an HD remaster, I would give my opinion as to which one I think is worth playing right now, and it seems like a no-brainer. However, I do think that I really need to talk about the HD remaster because despite being based on the original game and not Genma, there are a few small gameplay changes, and I think it also is important to talk about the updated visuals. To talk about the visual updates, well, they're nice, but they could have been better. And to elaborate, this remaster was not done in-house, but instead by the same team that worked on the recent iteration of Devil May Cry HD Collection. Some of you may already be aware of this, while others may not, but Neobards Entertainment didn't really do that great of a job with Devil May Cry HD Collection when it came to the quality of the remastered trilogy. While the collection itself wasn't unplayable, fans did notice the occasional poorly looped sound effect, visual glitches, and the like. So you might be wondering, are these issues impacting Onimusha HD? And that's not really the case here, but that's also not where my problem lies. You see, while visually speaking the remaster looks passable, I feel as though Capcom missed a really good opportunity to make this remaster look even better had it been done in-house. I look at the Resident Evil Remake and Resident Evil 0 HD remasters as prime examples of what kind of effort could have been put into the Onimusha HD remaster had it been done in-house by Capcom. Granted, those two remasters had problems of their own, but the overall quality to them was very nice, especially where the game just had redone rooms that were fully 3D. When it came to the two remasters, Capcom went by a case-by-case, room-by-room, lighting-by-lighting basis as to which rooms would stay pre-rendered and which rooms would be fully recreated in 3D. So when I see some of the rooms and areas in Onimusha HD that don't look as good as they could have been, given the lighting or the quality of the backgrounds themselves, I just can't help but wonder what could have been had it been done in-house. Although critiques or perhaps nitpicks of what could have been aside, I think the overall game again looks passable as an HD remaster. Now moving on to the new controls for the game, while I don't think that the new control scheme is bad, this is sort of the same issue that I had with the visuals. In this case, however, the problem is more so the fact that there aren't any alternate control schemes at all. You're just stuck with one preset. So if you wanted the analog controls to feel similarly to what it would have felt like back on PS2 had that game used analog controls back in the day, well, you can't. Now that being said, the game does have the analog controls now, which is very nice, which it was not originally possible to play the game with analog controls for movement purposes, and the animations for them are very similar to Resident Evil HD, so I will say despite that, I do find myself switching between the tank controls and analog controls as I play, and that was mostly because I do feel like the analog controls doubled as a very good quick turn ability. Also, a neat little feature to the remaster is the ability to switch weapons outside of the menu. It works in a very similar fashion to Devil May Cry, where hitting the right trigger switches your melee weapons, and hitting the left trigger switches your projectile-based weapons. The only major difference is that unlike Devil May Cry, you can only switch your weapons while you're standing still, so you can't do any like mid-combo switches on the fly. During combat, you have to stay still before you can switch to the next weapon. But that being said, I do think it's a very nice feature, and hopefully this is something that we can see improved upon within future remasters, or potentially a Onimusha 4 if there's something in the works for Capcom and this franchise. Just some food for thought, but that might be better for another topic for another video. So I think it's about time we wrap things up and ask the big question: is Onimusha Warlords worth picking up? Without a doubt, yes. The only difficult thing for me to answer is which version of Warlords do I recommend and for what reasons. To tell you the truth, though, I honestly recommend all three versions, but for various reasons. To start off with the PS2 version, I'd personally recommend this version simply because it's a great PS2 classic, and I really enjoy the soundtrack. Yes, the soundtrack is made by a fraud, but I still have those nostalgic feelings for them given that this is the one that I grew up with. The only drawback to this version is that there is no dual analog controller support, so you'll be using tank controls for your movement. Despite that, those of you that enjoy playing games such as Resident Evil and Dino Crisis should feel right at home with these controls. Then there's the Genma version, or the original Xbox version, whichever you prefer. This version is going to stand out the most given the fact that it includes new content, it has things that the original version does not have, and also the increased difficulty. That's going to make it stand out the most. In all honesty, this is somewhat why I'm still really disappointed at the fact that Capcom didn't remaster this version as opposed to the PS2 port, but beggars can't be choosers. Lastly, we have the HD remaster itself, being a port of the original PS2 version with some minor new additions and visual enhancements. This is the remaster that I've waited to see for years. While there are some minor complaints that I have with this port, such as not being based on the Genma version, or the fact that Capcom didn't do this remaster in-house, I can say without a doubt that this is the best way to play the original Onimusha. This is mostly due to the fact that it's now widely available across all current platforms, meaning that you don't really have to dust off your old PS2 and find some overly expensive way to have the game look good while being upscaled. On top of that, for anyone that's not a fan of tank controls, the new control scheme should in theory make it somewhat easier to get into this game from that perspective alone, although that's in theory, and well, really not in practice, because I suspect there's going to be some whining journalists crying out there about the game still being too hard even if they end up playing on easy mode. Throwing shade at gaming journalists aside, I think that the added addition of an on-the-fly weapon switching system is very much welcomed, and I'd like to see it expanded upon in the future with the next remaster or even a potential Onimusha 4. Onimusha Warlords HD released at $20 new in the US, and I'm very confident in saying that it's absolutely worth that price. In the case of the original, it varies in price, but generally is about the same price as the HD remaster, depending on the condition of the game itself. Of course, there's the Genma port, and that one generally tends to fluctuate in price, but at the time of this recording, it seems to be about $3 to $13 on Amazon. So with that all out of the way, I hope you all enjoyed today's video, and hopefully next time, whenever I get the chance to talk about Onimusha 2, we'll have a similar in-depth review talking about the original and the HD remaster for that game. For now though, one can only hope. Until then, I hope you all enjoyed what you saw here. Feel free to like, comment, share, maybe even subscribe to the channel. My name's been BioDevilDom, and I'll see you all in the next one. Matane.
10 years have passed. A new hero arrives with the power. Onimusha lives.